For most of human history, sunlight was not just light. It was a force that decided who survived, who could reproduce, and whose children would live long enough to grow. Our skin was shaped slowly, patiently, by a sun that rose and set over ancient landscapes, long before cities, long before electricity, long before glass and walls separated our bodies from the sky. Today we live indoors, beneath artificial light, under roofs that block the sun almost entirely, yet the skin covering our bodies still responds to a world that no longer exists. It darkens, it lightens, it protects, it struggles, according to rules written tens of thousands of years ago. In a sense, we are modern humans living inside skin tuned for an ancient sun, carrying a biological memory of light we rarely meet anymore. If our environment has changed so completely, but our skin has not, what does that mean for the way we live inside our bodies today? For most of human existence, the world was organized by the sun in ways that are difficult to imagine today. There were no clocks, no artificial light, no clear separation between day and night beyond what the sky itself allowed. Human life unfolded outdoors, under open light, with the position of the sun quietly shaping movement, rest, work, and survival. The skin was not a passive covering in this environment. It was the surface where the body met the world, exposed for hours each day to heat, glare, and radiation that could not be escaped. Every journey for food, every migration, every moment of rest happened under direct sunlight, and the body learned, slowly, how to endure it. Over tens of thousands of years, this constant exposure formed a relationship between sunlight and human skin that became deeply embedded in biology. The sun did not appear as an abstract force. It was a daily presence that could nourish, damage, or kill, depending on how the body responded to it. In these early landscapes, the sun determined more than warmth or visibility. It shaped when plants grew, when animals moved, and when water was available. Human survival depended on aligning the body with these cycles. Skin pigmentation became part of that alignment, offering protection in regions where ultraviolet radiation was intense and constant. Darker pigmentation reduced damage to DNA and protected essential nutrients within the body, especially in environments where sunlight was relentless. This was not a conscious adaptation. No generation chose it. It emerged quietly, as those whose skin could better tolerate the sun were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Over immense stretches of time, the sun wrote its influence directly onto the surface of the human body. The pace of this change was extraordinarily slow. Thousands of years passed with almost no alteration to the basic rhythm of light and life. The sun rose and set in familiar patterns, and the body adjusted itself within those limits. Human skin became calibrated to specific intensities of light, specific angles of the sun in the sky, specific seasonal variations. This calibration assumed a life spent outdoors, with bare skin exposed regularly to natural light. The body did not evolve for brief, occasional contact with sunlight. It evolved for immersion in it. The skin was shaped under conditions where shade was temporary and shelter was minimal, where light reached the body almost every day of life. This long history explains why skin cannot be understood as a modern trait. It is not designed for cities, for glass windows, or for electric illumination. It reflects a world where survival unfolded beneath an open sky, where the sun was both a guide and a threat. The biological memory of that world remains visible on the body today, even though the environment that formed it has largely disappeared. Modern humans still carry skin that expects the sun to play the same role it once did, even when daily life no longer provides that experience. The body has not forgotten the conditions under which it was shaped. What makes this history easy to overlook is its familiarity. The sun feels ordinary, predictable, and distant from modern concerns. Yet for the vast majority of human existence, it was one of the most powerful forces shaping survival. Skin emerged as a response to that force, refined slowly under pressure that never paused and never negotiated. This relationship between sunlight and skin was established long before agriculture, writing, or permanent settlements. It belongs to a deep past that continues to live on the surface of the human body, quietly influencing how we exist in the present. For early humans, sunlight was not an occasional presence, but a constant condition of life. Days were long, nights were dark, and there was little separation between the body and the environment it inhabited. Skin was exposed not only during work or travel, but during rest, social interaction, and sleep. Shelter was temporary and incomplete. Even shade shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Under these conditions, the human body learned to treat sunlight as something that could never be ignored. Skin became the first line of negotiation between biology and the outside world, responding continuously to light that arrived every morning without pause. Over time, this negotiation shaped how human populations survived in different environments. Ultraviolet radiation was one of the most powerful forces acting on the skin, even though it could not be seen or felt directly. Too much exposure damaged DNA and reduced the chances of successful reproduction. Too little exposure limited the body's ability to produce vitamin D, which is essential for bone development, immune function, and overall health. Skin pigmentation evolved within this narrow corridor of survival, balancing protection against harm with access to what the sun provided. This balance was not the same everywhere. Near the equator, where sunlight was intense and consistent throughout the year, darker pigmentation offered a clear advantage. It reduced cellular damage and preserved critical nutrients in the body. In these regions, skin functioned as a shield, allowing humans to remain outdoors for long periods without catastrophic biological cost. What is important to understand is that this process was never precise or efficient. Evolution does not design with foresight. It adjusts slowly, responding only to immediate pressures. Human skin did not become optimal in any absolute sense. It became sufficient. Sufficient to survive childhood, sufficient to reproduce, sufficient to pass genes forward. Once those conditions were met, there was no further pressure to refine or rethink the system. As a result, skin carries compromises that made sense in ancient environments but may appear puzzling in the modern world. These compromises are not errors. They are the outcome of survival under specific conditions repeated across countless generations. This long exposure to sunlight also shaped how humans structured their lives. Movement, migration, and settlement followed patterns of light and season. The body, including the skin, became synchronized with these patterns. The expectation was regular daylight, gradual seasonal change, and predictable cycles of exposure. Skin evolved assuming that light would arrive at certain angles, with certain intensities, and for certain durations. It was never prepared for sudden darkness during the day, or bright illumination during the night. It was shaped by a sky that changed slowly and consistently, not by environments where light could be switched on or off instantly. Because this relationship developed over such vast stretches of time, it became invisible to human awareness. There was no moment when people noticed their skin adapting. No generation experienced the full arc of change. Each person inherited a body already adjusted to conditions set long before they were born. Skin, in this sense, became a biological memory, carrying forward the record of sunlight experienced by ancestors rather than the conditions faced by the individual. This memory persisted because there was no reason for it to disappear. The environment remained stable enough, for long enough, that the ancient relationship between skin and sun continued without interruption. Only when viewed from a modern perspective does this stability appear fragile. For most of human history, nothing interrupted the dominance of natural light. Skin evolved under that assumption, quietly and patiently, never anticipating a future in which the sun would no longer define the structure of daily life. As generations passed, the relationship between human skin and sunlight became so stable that it faded into the background of daily life. There was no alternative rhythm to compare it to. Light arrived at dawn, faded at dusk, and disappeared completely at night. The body learned this pattern before birth, and never questioned it afterward. Skin adapted to this predictability, responding to gradual changes in intensity and duration rather than sudden shifts. In this environment, the idea of escaping sunlight entirely would have been meaningless. Even during rest, the body remained connected to the sky through warmth, reflection, and indirect exposure. Skin functioned as a living interface, continuously adjusting to conditions that rarely changed in abrupt or unexpected ways. This stability allowed small biological differences to accumulate over immense spans of time. Slight variations in pigmentation, thickness, and cellular response were tested repeatedly against the same environmental pressures. Those variations that reduced damage while preserving essential functions persisted. those that failed quietly disappeared. No dramatic transformation was required. The process worked precisely because it was slow. Skin did not need to adapt quickly, because the world itself was not changing quickly. For tens of thousands of years, sunlight followed familiar paths across familiar landscapes, reinforcing the same biological expectations generation after generation. Because of this, skin came to assume a level of exposure that modern humans rarely experience. It evolved expecting direct contact with natural light for many hours each day, across all stages of life. Childhood, adulthood, and old age unfolded under open skies. Even illness and injury occurred outdoors, where light continued to reach the body. The skin's protective and regulatory mechanisms were shaped by this continuity. They were calibrated for a life in which sunlight was unavoidable, not optional. There was no evolutionary incentive to prepare for prolonged absence from natural light, because such absence did not exist. This ancient arrangement also influenced how human populations expanded and settled. Migration followed routes where light, climate, and resources remained within tolerable limits. When groups moved into new regions, the change in sunlight was gradual on an evolutionary timescale. Skin responded slowly over many generations, adjusting to differences in angle, season, and intensity. The body carried forward what had worked before, modifying it only as much as survival demanded. In this way, skin became a map of long-term environmental history rather than a reflection of immediate surroundings. What is striking from a modern perspective is how little this system anticipated disruption. The skin does not store flexibility for sudden environmental shifts. It relies on continuity. Its responses are tuned to slow change, not abrupt transformation. This makes sense in a world where the sun itself appeared constant across a human lifetime. No individual ever lived long enough to witness meaningful alteration in the structure of daylight. As a result, the biological expectations written into skin were reinforced endlessly without challenge. Only much later would this ancient balance begin to unravel. But before that disruption, skin existed in harmony with the sun that shaped it, performing its role quietly and effectively. It carried no awareness of a future in which walls, roofs, and artificial light would interrupt the relationship that had defined human existence for so long. This long period of stability explains why skin still behaves as if the ancient sun remains central to human life, even when daily experience no longer reflects that reality. For early humans, skin was not simply a surface, but a working organ essential to survival. It regulated temperature, protected internal systems, and mediated constant contact with the environment. Unlike organs hidden inside the body, skin carried the burden of direct exposure. Heat, wind, dust, insects, and especially sunlight acted on it without interruption. Over time, skin developed ways to respond to these pressures, not through conscious control, but through slow biological adjustment. Its thickness, pigmentation, and cellular behavior reflected the conditions under which human life unfolded for tens of thousands of years. One of the most critical challenges skin faced was managing the energy carried by sunlight. Ultraviolet radiation could damage cells and interfere with reproduction, but sunlight was also necessary for essential biological processes. Vitamin D production depended on exposure to natural light, linking skin directly to bone strength, immune response, and long-term health. Skin therefore existed in a narrow zone of balance. Too much protection would block the benefits of sunlight. Too little protection would allow damage to accumulate. Over long periods of time, natural selection favored skin that could maintain this balance just well enough for survival. This balance did not result in perfection. Evolution does not seek optimal solutions. It settles for what works under prevailing conditions. Skin evolved to meet the demands of environments where humans lived most of their lives outdoors. The body assumed regular exposure to sunlight at predictable times of day and year. Under these assumptions, skin became an organ optimized for endurance rather than comfort. Sunburn, irritation, and long-term damage were not failures of design. They were acceptable costs in a system where survival and reproduction mattered more than long-term well-being. Skin also played a role in preserving internal stability. By controlling heat loss and moisture, it allowed humans to remain active in a wide range of climates. This capacity supported migration across open landscapes where shelter was limited. In hot regions, darker pigmentation reduced damage while allowing heat dissipation through sweating. In cooler but still sunny environments, skin maintained flexibility, adjusting slowly across generations as conditions changed. These adjustments were never immediate. They unfolded across many lifetimes, with each generation inheriting a version of skin shaped by ancestral conditions rather than present circumstances. Because skin functioned continuously, its influence often went unnoticed. Unlike hunger or pain, its work happened quietly. Damage accumulated slowly. Protection operated invisibly. This made skin's evolutionary role easy to overlook. Yet without it, long-term exposure to sunlight would have limited human expansion and survival. Skin allowed humans to remain active under open skies for hours each day, enabling hunting, gathering, and social interaction in environments that would otherwise have been hostile. The skin that modern humans inherit is therefore not tailored to individual lifestyle or location. It reflects a long history of adaptation to outdoor life under natural light. Its responses are based on assumptions that once held true for nearly all humans. It expects repeated exposure, gradual change, and continuity. These expectations were reasonable for most of human history. They only appear mismatched when viewed from a world that no longer resembles the one in which skin evolved. As human populations spread across different environments, the skin remained bound to the same fundamental task, maintaining internal stability while facing external pressure. This task did not change even as climates shifted, landscapes opened or closed, and resources became more or less abundant. Skin continued to operate as a buffer, absorbing heat, releasing moisture, and responding to light without awareness of why those conditions existed. What changed was the context in which these responses played out. In regions where sunlight was strong and consistent, skin that could tolerate prolonged exposure reduced the biological cost of daily life. In regions where sunlight was weaker or seasonal, the same protective strategies could become a disadvantage, limiting access to essential processes that depended on light. These tensions did not resolve quickly. They persisted across generations, shaping skin slowly as populations adapted to new conditions over thousands of years. This gradual adjustment was constrained by the pace of human reproduction and lifespan. Each generation lived only a small fraction of the time required for noticeable biological change. Skin could not respond to sudden environmental differences within a single lifetime. It could only pass forward slight variations, allowing natural selection to test them repeatedly. This meant that skin always lagged behind the environment, reflecting conditions from the recent evolutionary past rather than the present moment. Even when humans entered new regions, their skin initially carried assumptions formed elsewhere. Only after many generations did these assumptions begin to shift, and even then, the changes were modest rather than transformative. Because of this delay, skin accumulated compromises. It never fully matched any single environment perfectly. Instead, it settled into forms that were adequate across a range of conditions. This flexibility allowed humans to occupy diverse habitats, but it also meant that skin was never free from trade-offs. Protection from damage came at the cost of reduced efficiency in other functions. Sensitivity to light varied in ways that reflected ancestral exposure rather than immediate need. These trade-offs were invisible to individuals, but they shaped population-level outcomes over long periods of time. Another important aspect of skin as an organ is that it does not reset between generations. Each person is born with skin tuned by ancestral pressures, not by the environment they will personally experience. This inheritance creates a continuity that stretches far beyond any single life. Skin carries forward expectations about sunlight, temperature, and exposure that were reliable for most of human history. These expectations were reinforced again and again because the environment remained relatively stable on evolutionary timescales. The sun rose and set in predictable ways, seasons followed familiar patterns, and human life remained closely tied to natural light. This continuity made skin highly effective within its original context. It allowed humans to function outdoors for extended periods without immediate harm. It supported long hours of movement, labor, and social interaction under open skies. It also reduced the biological stress of living in environments where shelter was limited. In this sense, skin was a quiet enabler of human expansion. It did not draw attention to itself, but it made many forms of life possible that would otherwise have been too costly to sustain. What skin could not anticipate was a future in which the conditions it relied on would change rapidly. Its structure assumes gradual shifts, not abrupt transitions. It is designed to respond over generations, not years. This mismatch would only become visible much later, when the ancient balance between sunlight and daily life began to dissolve. Until then, skin continued to perform its role as it always had, shaped by pressures that once defined human existence and slow to release their hold on the body, even as the world around it changed. As human societies slowly accumulated experience across generations, the skin continued to operate under assumptions formed long before any individual life began. It responded to sunlight as if exposure were inevitable and prolonged, as if days would always unfold outdoors, and as if the body would regularly encounter natural light without barriers. These assumptions shaped how skin repaired itself, how it distributed pigment, and how it balanced protection with absorption. They also shaped how skin interacted with other systems in the body, including hormones, immune responses, and metabolic processes that depended indirectly on light. None of these interactions evolved in isolation. They formed a tightly linked network that assumed stability in the external environment, especially in the daily presence of the sun. Because that stability persisted for so long, the system never needed to question its own design. Skin did not evolve to ask whether sunlight would still be present. It evolved assuming that it always would be. Over tens of thousands of years, this assumption was never meaningfully challenged. Even during migrations, famines, or climatic shifts, the sun remained a constant feature of human life. Its intensity varied, its angle changed, but its role never disappeared. As a result, skin learned to treat sunlight as a permanent condition rather than a variable one. This shaped not only pigmentation but also the timing of biological processes that followed daily and seasonal rhythms. Skin became part of a larger timing system, aligning the body with cycles of light and darkness that governed activity, rest, and recovery. These rhythms were reinforced across generations, becoming deeply embedded in biology. Because change occurred so slowly, there was no pressure to develop flexibility for sudden environmental shifts. Skin adapted to gradual transitions, not abrupt ones. It adjusted across many lifetimes, carrying forward patterns that had proven sufficient rather than optimal. This is why skin retains features that appear mismatched to modern life. It is not failing to adapt. It is continuing to perform exactly as it was shaped to perform, based on expectations formed in a world where sunlight structured nearly every aspect of existence. The continuity of this relationship explains why skin still reacts strongly to light, even when exposure is brief or irregular. Its responses are calibrated for a different pace of life, one in which the sun was encountered daily and predictably. This calibration persists because there has not yet been enough time, in evolutionary terms, for a new pattern to replace it. The biological memory carried by skin is therefore not an error or an accident. It is the residue of a long period of stability that defined what it meant to be human for most of our history. Only when viewed against the backdrop of rapid environmental change does this memory appear out of place. Until that disruption, skin functioned quietly, reliably, and without conflict, shaped by ancient sunlight and carrying its imprint forward into every new generation. Ultraviolet radiation exerted its influence on human skin in a way that was constant, but almost never perceived. Unlike heat or cold, it did not announce itself clearly. It accumulated quietly, acting on cells day after day, season after season, across entire lifetimes. Early humans did not need to understand ultraviolet light for it to shape their survival. Those whose skin could better withstand its effects were more likely to remain healthy long enough to reproduce, while those whose skin allowed damage to accumulate faced reduced fertility or early death. Over many generations, this invisible pressure filtered human populations without drama or awareness, slowly biasing survival towards certain biological responses while removing others from the gene pool. The sun did not select intentionally, it simply persisted, and skin either endured or failed under its presence. In regions where sunlight was strong year-round, ultraviolet exposure was not an occasional stress but a daily condition. Skin cells were repeatedly damaged and repaired, creating a long-term demand for protective mechanisms. Increased melanin production reduced the penetration of harmful radiation, protecting DNA and preserving essential nutrients such as folate, which played a critical role in fetal development. Loss of folate could lead to reproductive failure, making its protection directly relevant to evolutionary success. Under these conditions, darker pigmentation was not cosmetic or incidental. It was a functional response to an environment that applied pressure without pause. The skin that survived was the skin that could absorb punishment while maintaining internal stability. At the same time, ultraviolet light served a necessary role in human biology. Exposure triggered the synthesis of vitamin D, supporting bone health, immune function, and overall physical resilience. Skin, therefore, had to perform a careful balancing act. Too much protection reduced vitamin D production. Too little protection increased cellular damage. This balance did not resolve cleanly. It shifted depending on latitude, season, and lifestyle. The skin that emerged from this process was not ideal in all circumstances. It was shaped by compromise, responding to the dominant pressures of a given environment while accepting costs elsewhere. Evolution tolerated these costs because they did not prevent reproduction under ancestral conditions. What made ultraviolet pressure so powerful was its consistency. Unlike predators or climate events, it did not come and go. It was present whenever the sun was in the sky. This consistency allowed even small differences in skin response to matter over time. Minor advantages accumulated across generations, slowly amplifying their effects. Because human lifespans were short relative to evolutionary time, no individual experienced the full impact of these changes. The process unfolded beyond perception, operating at a scale too large to notice within a single life. Skin became the record of this pressure, carrying the results of countless interactions with light that no one ever consciously observed. The environment reinforced this pressure through daily routines. Hunting, gathering, traveling, and social interaction occurred outdoors, often during peak sunlight hours. Shade was temporary and unreliable. Clothing was minimal or absent for much of human history. Skin bore the full burden of exposure, functioning as both shield and sensor. It responded not only to intensity but to duration, accumulating the effects of repeated contact with ultraviolet radiation over years. These accumulated effects shaped population-level outcomes even when they remained invisible at the level of individual experience. Because ultraviolet pressure acted slowly and continuously, it allowed skin traits to stabilize within populations over long periods. Once a balance was reached that supported survival and reproduction, there was little incentive for further change. The sun continued to rise, the pressure remained steady, and skin maintained its established responses. This long equilibrium explains why skin characteristics persisted for tens of thousands of years without dramatic alteration. They were not optimized for comfort or longevity. They were sufficient to endure an environment where ultraviolet light quietly governed biological outcomes, generation after generation. While ultraviolet radiation acted as a constant filter, its effects were not evenly distributed across the human body or across human lives. Skin responded differently depending on age, health, and cumulative exposure. Children inherited skin already tuned by ancestral pressures, but its interaction with sunlight changed as the body grew and aged. Early life demanded protection for development and reproduction, while later life carried less evolutionary weight. Because natural selection favors traits that support survival to reproductive age, skin was shaped primarily to function well during early and middle adulthood. Damage that accumulated later in life rarely altered evolutionary outcomes. As a result, skin evolved to endure sunlight long enough to pass genes forward, not to preserve comfort or integrity indefinitely. This explains why long-term consequences of ultraviolet exposure were tolerated within the system. They occurred after the window that mattered most to evolution had largely closed. Ultraviolet pressure also interacted with social and behavioral patterns. Humans did not simply exist under the sun in isolation. They moved in groups, shared tasks, and followed daily routines that concentrated exposure during certain hours. Midday activity, when sunlight was strongest, was often unavoidable. Food acquisition, migration, and cooperation depended on daylight. Skin therefore faced repeated exposure during periods of peak radiation, reinforcing the selective pressure for protective responses. Over time, even slight advantages in managing this exposure could influence reproductive success. Those whose skin reduced damage without fully blocking necessary functions gained a subtle but persistent edge. Importantly, These pressures operated without producing sharp boundaries. There was no single threshold where skin suddenly failed or succeeded. Instead, there was a gradient of outcomes shaped by probability. Slightly more protection meant slightly less damage. Slightly better vitamin D production meant slightly stronger bones or immune responses. Over many generations, these small differences accumulated, shifting population characteristics without requiring dramatic change. Skin became a product of statistical survival rather than precise engineering. Its features reflect what was common enough to persist, not what was perfect. This gradual filtering explains why skin variation appears continuous rather than discrete. There were no fixed categories imposed by evolution. Instead, there was a range of responses shaped by local sunlight conditions and inherited history. Populations living under similar skies tended to converge towards similar solutions, but variation always remained. Skin carried both shared patterns and individual differences, reflecting the complexity of the pressures acting upon it. These differences did not signal hierarchy or progress. They were simply records of adaptation under different levels of ultraviolet stress. The long-term stability of ultraviolet exposure reinforced these patterns. For most of human history, the intensity and rhythm of sunlight changed slowly enough that skin never needed to abandon its existing strategies. Even during climate shifts, the sun remained present, and ultraviolet radiation continued to reach the body. Skin adjusted only as much as necessary to remain functional. Once a workable balance was established, further change offered little additional benefit. This is why skin responses remained conservative, favoring continuity over experimentation. From a modern perspective, this conservatism can appear limiting. Skin reacts strongly to ultraviolet light even when exposure is brief or sporadic. It carries defenses calibrated for a world where sunlight was unavoidable, not optional. These reactions are not malfunctions. They are expressions of an ancient logic shaped by persistent pressure. Skin continues to behave as if ultraviolet radiation will remain a defining feature of daily life, because for nearly all of human existence, it was. That expectation remains embedded in biology, long after the conditions that formed it began to fade. Over very long stretches of time, the pressure exerted by ultraviolet light did not act in isolation but interacted with other environmental forces that shaped where and how humans lived. Climate, altitude, cloud cover, and seasonal variation all influenced how much ultraviolet radiation reached the skin. These factors changed slowly, often over thousands of years, giving skin time to adjust in small increments rather than abrupt shifts. In higher altitudes, thinner atmospheres increased ultraviolet exposure even in cooler climates. In regions with frequent cloud cover, light was diffused but never eliminated. Skin responded not to a single condition but to a complex pattern of light exposure that repeated itself across generations. This complexity reinforced conservative biological strategies, favoring responses that could function across a range of conditions rather than optimizing for any one extreme. Skin became resilient rather than specialized, capable of tolerating variation without collapsing under it. This resilience allowed human populations to persist in diverse environments while carrying forward a common biological framework shaped by sunlight. Over time, this framework became deeply ingrained, making skin one of the most environmentally informed organs in the human body. It reflected not only immediate exposure but the accumulated history of light experienced by ancestors across many landscapes. Because the sun remained a constant presence despite these variations, the core logic governing skin never needed to change. Ultraviolet radiation continued to arrive daily, reinforcing the same selective pressures even as their intensity shifted slightly from place to place. This persistence created a kind of evolutionary inertia. Once skin responses proved sufficient, they were retained, copied, and passed forward with little modification. The result was a system optimized for endurance rather than adaptability, capable of absorbing long-term pressure but slow to respond to rapid change. This inertia explains why skin today still reacts strongly to patterns of light that no longer define daily life. It behaves as if exposure will be prolonged and unavoidable, because that assumption held true for most of human history. Even when modern humans spend little time outdoors, skin continues to deploy protective mechanisms designed for a world of constant sunlight. These mechanisms may appear excessive or mismatched, but they are consistent with the conditions under which they evolved. Skin does not measure relevance by modern standards. It follows rules established through repetition over deep time. In this sense, the influence of ultraviolet light did not end when environments began to change. It persisted as an internal guideline, shaping how skin responds regardless of context. The ancient sun continues to exert its influence not because it is still present in the same way, but because biology has not yet released the assumptions built under its dominance. When humans began to move away from the regions where their species first evolved, they did not leave sunlight behind, but they encountered it in unfamiliar forms. As groups gradually migrated across latitudes, the angle, intensity, and seasonal rhythm of sunlight shifted. Days became shorter or longer depending on the time of year. Winters reduced exposure for months at a time. The sun no longer arrived overhead but travelled lower across the sky, changing how ultraviolet radiation reached the body. These changes were not sudden on an evolutionary scale. They unfolded across many generations, allowing skin to respond slowly rather than catastrophically. Each movement into a new region carried forward assumptions formed elsewhere, and skin initially responded as if the old environment still applied. Only over long periods did small adjustments begin to appear, reflecting the new balance between protection and exposure demanded by different skies. This movement across latitudes introduced a new tension into human biology. Skin that had evolved under intense, consistent sunlight now faced environments where light could be scarce for much of the year. In these regions, protection from ultraviolet radiation was no longer the dominant challenge. Instead, the ability to absorb enough sunlight to support essential biological processes became increasingly important. Vitamin D production, once abundant, became limited. This shift placed pressure on skin to allow more light to penetrate, reducing pigmentation over many generations. The process did not erase earlier adaptations. It modified them cautiously, preserving enough protection to manage occasional exposure while increasing sensitivity to weaker sunlight. Skin became a compromise shaped by distance from the equator, rather than a complete redesign. Migration also altered daily patterns of life. In higher latitudes, seasonal extremes influenced when humans could hunt, travel, or gather food. Long summers concentrated activity into periods of extended daylight, while long winters compressed life into narrow windows of light. Skin evolved under these rhythms, adjusting not only to average exposure but to its uneven distribution across the year. The body learned to tolerate months of limited sunlight, followed by periods of intense exposure, a pattern very different from the steady conditions of equatorial regions. These rhythms further reinforced gradual adaptation, as skin responded to repeated seasonal cycles rather than constant pressure. What is important is that none of these changes occurred by intention. Humans did not choose to redesign their skin as they migrated. The adjustments were passive outcomes of survival and reproduction under new conditions. Those whose skin allowed sufficient vitamin D production while maintaining basic protection were more likely to remain healthy and fertile. Over time, these traits became more common, not because they were ideal, but because they were adequate within a specific environmental context. Skin carried forward both the legacy of intense sunlight and the new demands of weaker skies, blending them into a functional but imperfect system. This blending produced visible variation without clear boundaries. As populations spread across continents, skin reflected gradients of light rather than fixed categories. Each region imposed slightly different pressures, and skin responded in small increments. The result was continuity rather than division, a spectrum shaped by geography and time. Skin remained a record of movement, encoding the history of where humans had lived rather than where they happened to be born. Despite these changes, one assumption remained constant. Skin continued to expect regular contact with natural light. Even in regions where sunlight was limited, it was still a defining feature of daily life. There was no prolonged absence, no complete separation between body and sky. Migration altered the form of sunlight, but not its central role. Skin evolved within this constraint, adjusting slowly while retaining its fundamental dependence on the sun. This dependence would only be challenged much later, when humans began to live in ways that severed the ancient connection almost entirely. As humans settled into new regions over long periods of time, The differences in sunlight were no longer temporary challenges but stable conditions shaping everyday life, with generations being born, living, and dying under skies that behaved differently from those of their ancestors. As in northern regions, sunlight arrived at lower angles, stretched into long summer days, and nearly vanished during winter, while in southern regions, intensity remained higher even though seasonal variation still altered exposure patterns. And throughout these environments, skin continued to respond not to isolated moments of light, but to repeating long-term patterns, where what mattered was not a single sunny day or dark season, but the cumulative effect of years lived under similar conditions, allowing small biological tendencies to persist and slowly increase in frequency within populations across many generations. One of the most important consequences of this shift was the changing balance between protection and absorption, because in regions with reduced ultraviolet intensity, the cost of excessive protection became more significant, as skin that blocked too much light limited vitamin D synthesis and increased the risk of skeletal weakness and reproductive complications, meaning individuals whose skin allowed more light penetration gained a subtle but persistent advantage, even if it reduced protection against occasional high exposure, a process that did not transform skin quickly but nudged populations toward lighter pigmentation over long stretches of time, slowly enough that no generation experienced it as change, with each person inheriting skin that felt normal within their environment despite its form shifting across centuries. At the same time, migration did not erase the influence of earlier environments, as populations carried genetic traits shaped by previous sunlight conditions that did not disappear immediately when circumstances changed, resulting in skin that reflected a layered history, combining responses to intense ancestral sunlight with newer adjustments to weaker or more variable light, which explains why skin often appears imperfectly matched to local conditions, since it is not solely a product of the present environment, but of many environments experienced in sequence, as evolution rarely clears the slate and instead modifies what already exists, retaining features that are no longer ideal but not harmful enough to remove. Social organization reinforced these patterns because in many regions, seasonal activity concentrated exposure into particular times of year, with long summers encouraging extended outdoor labor and winters reducing exposure almost entirely, leading skin to adapt by tolerating fluctuation rather than optimizing for consistency. While the body learned to manage periods of scarcity followed by abundance in both light and resources, shaping not only pigmentation but broader physiological responses linked to sunlight such as metabolism and immune function, with skin remaining embedded within this larger system as one element in a complex web of environmental cues. Importantly, none of these adaptations implied improvement or decline, as they represented alignment with local conditions over time rather than movement toward a single ideal form. Since skin diversified as humans diversified their habitats, and each variation reflected a different balance of costs and benefits imposed by sunlight, climate, and lifestyle, functioning as a response to place rather than a marker of progress, allowing human populations to survive across a wide range of environments without requiring rapid or radical biological change. Through this long process, skin continued to act as a historical record, preserving traces of where populations had been rather than only where they were, as migration shaped skin slowly enough that it always lagged behind movement, carrying forward memories of past skies even as new ones emerged, a lag that was not a flaw but a natural consequence of evolution, operating on a timescale far longer than any individual life, with skin adapting just enough to support survival while retaining echoes of ancient sunlight that no longer fully defined the world humans inhabited. As human populations remained in these new environments for longer periods, the slow adjustment of skin reached a kind of temporary equilibrium that could last for thousands of years. Once pigmentation and skin responses became sufficient to balance protection from ultraviolet damage with access to sunlight for essential biological functions, further change offered little immediate advantage. Natural selection does not push endlessly once survival and reproduction are secured. In these conditions, skin stabilized, carrying forward a solution that worked well enough under local skies. This stability allowed generations to pass without noticeable alteration in appearance or function, even though the environment continued to impose the same pressures day after day. Skin became quietly aligned with the rhythms of light specific to each region, responding predictably to seasons and angles of the sun without requiring further adjustment. What mattered was not perfection, but reliability across an entire lifespan spent largely outdoors. This regional stabilization did not mean uniformity across the species. Different populations reached different balances, each shaped by local sunlight patterns, climate, and lifestyle. In some regions, protection remained the dominant requirement, while in others, absorption became more critical. These differences persisted because movement between regions was limited and slow. Populations lived, reproduced, and adapted largely within the same environmental boundaries for many generations. As a result, skin reflected long-term residence rather than constant mixing. It encoded a history of place, carrying the imprint of specific skies rather than a generalized human condition. These imprints accumulated quietly, producing visible variation without sharp divisions, as changes followed gradients of light rather than abrupt borders. At the same time, skin retained assumptions inherited from even earlier periods. Adaptations layered on top of one another instead of replacing what came before. Traits that were no longer essential were not immediately removed unless they caused clear harm. This meant that skin often carried excess protection or sensitivity relative to current conditions. Such mismatches were tolerated because they did not interfere with reproduction. Evolution favored continuity over optimization, preserving structures that had once been useful even if their relevance diminished. This layering produced a form of biological inertia, where skin lagged behind the environment rather than tracking it precisely. This inertia was reinforced by the slow pace of environmental change itself. For most of human history, sunlight patterns shifted gradually, allowing skin to respond incrementally. There were no sudden losses or gains of light that demanded immediate biological redesign. Under these circumstances, a conservative system performed better than a flexible one. Skin that resisted rapid change remained functional across generations, while overly sensitive systems risked instability. The body therefore retained strategies that emphasized endurance and predictability, accepting inefficiency in exchange for survival across uncertain futures. By the time humans began to modify their environments more aggressively, skin had already been shaped by tens of thousands of years of relatively stable light exposure. It carried expectations formed under skies that behaved consistently over evolutionary time. These expectations did not dissolve when conditions changed. They remained embedded in biology, guiding how skin responds regardless of context. This is why skin today still behaves as if long hours under natural sunlight are normal, even when daily life no longer reflects that reality. The slow completion of this regional adaptation marks the end of a long phase in which sunlight and skin remain tightly linked, setting the stage for a far more abrupt disruption that would arrive much later in human history. As human biology continued to operate under assumptions formed by ancient sunlight, one critical tension emerged that would quietly shape health and survival across generations. This tension was not visible on the surface of the body, but it was written into the chemistry beneath the skin. Sunlight was no longer only a source of danger to be managed. It became a resource that the body depended on to function correctly. Vitamin D synthesis linked skin directly to skeletal strength, immune stability, and reproductive success. In environments where sunlight was abundant, this link posed little challenge. The body received enough exposure through daily life outdoors, and skin could afford to prioritize protection without jeopardizing internal balance. But as humans moved into regions with weaker or more seasonal sunlight, this relationship became fragile. Skin that blocked too much light could undermine the very biological processes needed for survival. This fragility created a narrow evolutionary corridor. On one side lay the risk of cellular damage and nutrient loss from excessive ultraviolet exposure. On the other lay the risk of deficiency, particularly during long winters or extended periods of low sunlight. Vitamin D deficiency weakened bones, increased susceptibility to illness, and affected reproductive outcomes, especially in early life. These consequences mattered directly to evolution because they influenced whether individuals could survive childhood and reproduce successfully. Skin, therefore, had to negotiate a delicate compromise, allowing enough light to pass through while still maintaining a basic level of protection. This compromise was never exact. It shifted depending on latitude, season, and lifestyle, and it unfolded slowly across many generations. What made this balance especially complex was that it could not be recalibrated within a single lifetime. A person born with skin shaped by ancestral conditions could not biologically adjust its baseline behavior to match a drastically different light environment. The body relied on inherited traits rather than real-time adaptation. As a result, populations carried forward skin responses that were always slightly out of sync with their current surroundings. In regions with limited sunlight, even small increases in light absorption could offer a survival advantage over generations. Individuals whose skin permitted marginally higher vitamin D production were more likely to maintain skeletal health and immune resilience, particularly during early development. Over time, these marginal advantages accumulated, subtly reshaping population-level traits without any clear moment of transition. Importantly, this process did not eliminate the need for protection. Occasional high exposure still posed risks, especially during seasonal peaks or periods of outdoor labor. Skin therefore retained defensive mechanisms even as it became more permissive to light. The result was not an optimized solution, but a workable one. Evolution favored skin that could perform adequately under competing demands rather than excelling at either extreme. This explains why skin remains vulnerable to both damage and deficiency. It was never designed to solve one problem completely. It evolved to survive within a narrow range of conditions that held true for most of human history. This balance also interacted with social behavior. Seasonal rhythms structured when people worked outdoors, when they rested, and how long they remained exposed to sunlight. In some regions, short summers concentrated exposure into intense periods, while long winters offered little opportunity for light contact. Skin evolved assuming these rhythms would repeat reliably. It did not prepare for environments where exposure might be consistently low year-round, or where light could be present without the spectral qualities of natural sunlight. The biological expectations embedded in skin were shaped by patterns that persisted long enough to appear permanent. From a modern perspective, this ancient compromise reveals a deeper truth about human biology. The body is not built for optimal performance under all conditions. It is built to survive just well enough under the conditions that dominated its evolutionary past. Skin reflects this principle clearly. It carries defenses against damage while depending on the very force it must resist. This contradiction is not a flaw. It is the outcome of long-term survival under sunlight that was sometimes too strong and sometimes too weak, but always unavoidable. By the time human environments began to change rapidly, this compromise was already deeply embedded. Setting limits on how flexibly skin could respond to new patterns of light, as human biology continued to operate under assumptions formed by ancient sunlight, a quiet but fundamental tension emerged beneath the surface of the skin, shaping survival across generations without ever becoming visible as a single event. Sunlight was not only a threat that needed to be controlled, but also a resource the body depended on to function correctly. Through the skin, ultraviolet light enabled the synthesis of vitamin D, linking exposure directly to bone strength, immune stability, and reproductive success. In environments where sunlight was abundant and consistent, this relationship remained stable because daily outdoor life provided enough exposure for these processes to proceed without difficulty. Skin could prioritize protection against damage while still allowing sufficient light to reach the body. However, as humans moved into regions where sunlight was weaker, more seasonal, or unevenly distributed across the year, this balance became fragile. Skin that blocked too much light reduced vitamin D production, increasing the risk of skeletal weakness, illness, and complications during early development, all of which directly affected survival and reproduction. This fragility placed skin inside a narrow evolutionary corridor where neither extreme protection nor extreme permeability could succeed on its own. Too much defense increased deficiency, while too little defense increased damage. Skin was therefore forced into compromise, allowing enough light to pass through to support internal systems while maintaining a basic level of protection against harm. This compromise was never precise or stable. It shifted slowly depending on latitude, season, and patterns of daily life, unfolding over thousands of years rather than within individual lifetimes. Because skin could not recalibrate itself in response to sudden environmental change, each generation inherited a biological configuration shaped by ancestral conditions rather than present realities. Individuals born under weaker sunlight carried skin still tuned to brighter skies, and only over many generations did small adjustments begin to accumulate. Even then, these adjustments were modest. Slight increases in light absorption could improve vitamin D availability during childhood, offering subtle advantages that accumulated statistically across populations rather than dramatically within individuals. At the same time, protection could never be abandoned entirely, because occasional high exposure remained part of seasonal life, especially during periods of outdoor labor. Skin therefore retained defensive mechanisms even as it became more permissive to light, resulting in a system that was functional but never optimal. This explains why skin remains vulnerable to both deficiency and damage. It was not designed to solve one problem completely, but to survive within a narrow range of conditions that held true for most of human history. Social rhythms reinforced this balance. Seasonal work patterns concentrated exposure into short periods of intensity followed by long periods of scarcity. Skin evolved assuming these cycles would repeat reliably, shaping not only pigmentation but broader physiological systems linked to sunlight, including metabolism and immune response. The expectations embedded in skin were shaped by repetition and stability, not by flexibility. From a modern perspective, this ancient compromise reveals a core truth about human biology. The body is not built to perform optimally under all conditions, but to endure just well enough under the conditions that dominated its evolutionary past. Skin embodies this logic clearly. It depends on the same sunlight it must resist, carrying a contradiction that is not a flaw, but a consequence of survival under a sun that was sometimes too strong and sometimes too weak, yet always unavoidable. By the time human environments began to change rapidly, this compromise was already deeply embedded, limiting how quickly skin could respond to new patterns of light. As this fragile balance persisted across generations, the cost of relying on ancient sunlight became more apparent in the structure of human health rather than in immediate survival. Skin continued to regulate exposure according to rules shaped long before modern environments existed, assuming that contact with natural light would arrive regularly and predictably. When that assumption held, internal systems remained stable. When it did not, subtle strain accumulated. Vitamin D levels fluctuated not because skin malfunctioned, but because its expectations no longer matched reality. In regions with prolonged winters or persistent cloud cover, the body experienced long stretches without adequate ultraviolet input, yet skin maintained its inherited threshold for protection. This mismatch created biological tension that rarely caused sudden collapse, but gradually influenced resilience, growth, and immunity over the course of a lifetime. Children born under limited sunlight inherited skin shaped by brighter ancestral environments, and their bodies had to operate within constraints that evolution had not prepared them to resolve quickly. Bone density, muscle development, and immune regulation became quietly dependent on environmental conditions that skin could not fully control. Over generations, populations responded not through conscious adjustment, but through differential survival and reproduction, allowing traits that slightly eased these tensions to persist. Even so, the process remained slow, constrained by the fact that sunlight itself did not disappear entirely. Seasonal exposure still provided enough input to prevent catastrophic failure, allowing the ancient compromise to continue without forcing radical change. Skin therefore remained locked into a system of partial adaptation, responding just enough to sustain life without ever fully aligning with new patterns of light. This partial alignment extended beyond vitamin D alone. Sunlight interacted with hormonal rhythms, sleep cycles, and immune signaling, all of which were coordinated under the assumption of natural day and night. Skin acted as an entry point for these signals, influencing timing throughout the body. When exposure became irregular, these downstream systems experienced strain not because they were broken, but because they were operating on outdated expectations. The body compensated through short-term mechanisms rather than structural redesign, masking the depth of the mismatch. From an evolutionary perspective, there was little incentive to resolve this tension completely because it did not prevent reproduction under most conditions. Individuals could survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes even while carrying subtle disadvantages that accumulated later in life. As a result, skin continued to reflect priorities that favored early life survival over long-term optimization. This explains why the biological costs of limited sunlight often emerge gradually, influencing aging, resilience, and chronic vulnerability rather than immediate viability. Skin remained sufficient for its original task, even as the environment slowly drifted away from the conditions that shaped it. This drift did not trigger rapid correction, because evolution responds to outcomes measured across generations, not discomfort experienced within a single lifetime. The ancient balance therefore persisted by default, reinforced by the absence of strong selective pressure to dismantle it. In this way, skin became a mediator of delayed consequences, allowing life to continue while quietly carrying the burden of an outdated relationship with light. The persistence of this system illustrates how deeply evolutionary history can constrain present biology. Skin does not evaluate whether its assumptions remain accurate. It executes a program refined under conditions that once dominated human existence. Even as environments changed, that program remained active, shaping health in ways that are easy to overlook precisely because they unfold slowly. The tension between protection and absorption never resolved into a stable solution suitable for all contexts. It remained an ongoing negotiation inherited by each generation, reflecting the limits of adaptation in a body built to survive the past rather than anticipate the future. As this unresolved tension continued across long spans of time, the skin remained caught between two incompatible demands that evolution never forced it to fully reconcile. On one side, protection against ultraviolet damage remained essential, because sunlight could still injure cells, disrupt reproduction, and compromise survival when exposure became intense. On the other side, the internal systems of the body continued to depend on sunlight-derived signals that could not be replaced by any other environmental input. Skin, therefore, operated as a gatekeeper that could never close completely and could never open fully. It regulated access rather than eliminating risk, maintaining a narrow channel through which light could enter without overwhelming the body. This regulation was shaped by averages rather than extremes, by what worked most of the time rather than what worked best in every situation. Because human environments remained broadly similar for so long, this approach was sufficient. Skin did not need to resolve the contradiction it embodied, because the world rarely pushed it beyond tolerable limits. Even in regions with reduced sunlight, seasonal exposure often provided just enough input to keep internal systems functioning, preventing severe failure while allowing the inherited compromise to persist. Over generations, this created a pattern where biological costs accumulated slowly rather than triggering immediate selection for change. Weak bones, reduced immune resilience, or subtle metabolic strain often appeared later in life, after reproduction had already occurred. From an evolutionary perspective, these outcomes carried little weight. Skin continued to perform its primary role during the critical years of survival and reproduction, even if its long-term performance was imperfect. This prioritization shaped how human biology handled sunlight-related stress. Short-term adequacy mattered more than long-term optimization, reinforcing the persistence of ancient assumptions. The body learned to tolerate gradual imbalance rather than correct it, relying on behavioral adjustments, seasonal rhythms, and social structures to compensate for what biology did not resolve. Clothing, shelter, and patterns of activity evolved culturally rather than biologically, reducing exposure without requiring the skin itself to change. These cultural adaptations masked the growing mismatch between skin and environment, allowing the underlying biological tension to remain unaddressed. Skin continued to behave as though sunlight would remain a regular feature of daily life, even as human behavior began to limit exposure in subtle ways. This divergence unfolded slowly, without clear thresholds or dramatic consequences, making it difficult for selection to act decisively. As long as survival and reproduction were possible, the inherited compromise endured. The result was a body increasingly supported by external solutions while retaining internal systems calibrated for a different world. Skin became a mediator between ancient biology and changing behavior, absorbing the strain created by this divergence. It continued to manage exposure according to rules shaped by deep time, while the environment drifted away from those rules in small but cumulative steps. This process did not produce a crisis in any single generation. Instead, it produced continuity, carrying forward a system that was no longer fully aligned with lived conditions but still capable of sustaining life. The persistence of this state reveals how evolution favors stability over precision. Skin was not redesigned to anticipate future environments. It was preserved because it worked well enough in the past and did not fail catastrophically in the present. This conservative logic ensured survival across uncertain conditions, but it also locked human biology into patterns that would become increasingly strained as the relationship with natural light changed further. By the end of this long phase, skin stood as a testament to endurance rather than adaptability, maintaining an ancient compromise that set the limits of how the body could respond to the sun, even as the world prepared to change in ways that biology had never encountered before. As humans continued to pass through generations without dramatic biological redesign, the skin began to function less like a responsive interface and more like a record of past environments embedded in living tissue. Unlike tools or shelters which could be altered quickly, skin carried forward solutions that had proven reliable over deep time. Every layer reflected decisions made not by individuals but by survival itself, preserving traits that once aligned the body with ancient sunlight. This made skin a kind of biological archive, storing information about climates, latitudes, and exposure patterns that no longer define daily life. Even when humans moved or changed their behavior, the skin they carried remained tied to the conditions under which their ancestors had lived. It did not reset with birth or adjust to new surroundings within a lifetime. It arrived already configured, bearing expectations shaped by histories far older than any memory or tradition. These expectations influenced how the body responded to light, heat, and seasonal change, regardless of whether those cues still arrived as they once had. In this way, skin preserved environmental information long after the environment itself had shifted. The body carried forward traces of past skies, past seasons, and past rhythms, not as conscious knowledge but as built-in behavior. This persistence created continuity across generations, allowing populations to survive without requiring constant biological innovation. Skin did not need to anticipate future conditions. It only needed to remain adequate under those that had dominated for most of human history. Over time, this adequacy hardened into structure. Traits that were no longer essential were not actively removed unless they interfered with reproduction. Evolution favored retention over replacement, layering new adjustments onto old frameworks rather than starting anew. As a result, skin accumulated features that made sense together only when viewed across long spans of time. Some responses reflected intense sunlight near the equator, others reflected adaptation to weaker light at higher latitudes, and still others reflected compromises formed during migration. These layers coexisted within the same organ, producing a complex response system that could appear contradictory in modern contexts. From an archaeological perspective, skin functioned like a living artifact. It held evidence of where humans had been, not just where they were. Just as tools carry marks of their use, skin carried marks of ancient exposure that shaped its structure and behavior. This record was not precise or complete. It did not capture every detail of past environments. Instead, it preserved what mattered most for survival under repeated conditions. Light intensity, seasonal duration, and cumulative exposure left the deepest imprint because they exerted the most consistent pressure. Other factors faded more quickly. Over generations, the skin's responses became standardized within populations, not because they were perfect, but because they were reliable enough to persist. This reliability allowed humans to expand geographically without requiring immediate biological overhaul. Skin acted as a buffer, absorbing environmental differences while maintaining internal stability. In doing so, it reduced the urgency of adaptation, allowing cultural solutions to take precedence. Clothing, shelter, and behavioral patterns compensated for biological limitations, further reducing pressure on skin to change. This interaction between biology and culture reinforced the preservation of ancient traits. As long as survival remained possible, skin continued to carry forward its inherited logic. The result was a body that moved through history while retaining features anchored in prehistory. Skin became a silent witness to human movement, preserving the imprint of ancient sunlight even as environments transformed. This archival role set limits on how quickly biology could respond to new conditions, ensuring continuity at the cost of flexibility. By the time human environments began to change rapidly, skin was already deeply committed to assumptions formed under skies that no longer governed daily life, carrying forward a record that evolution had little reason to erase. As this biological record accumulated across time, the skin began to carry information that no individual experience could explain. A person could spend their entire life in one place, under one pattern of light, yet their skin would still respond according to assumptions formed elsewhere, long before their birth. This disconnect existed because skin does not learn from personal history. It inherits a template refined by countless previous lives. That template encoded probabilities rather than certainties, reflecting what environments had most often been like, rather than what they currently were. In this way, skin functioned as a long-term memory system, storing lessons learned across thousands of years while remaining indifferent to short-term change. The body relied on this memory because it had proven dependable for survival across deep time. Even when conditions shifted gradually, the inherited template usually remained close enough to reality to avoid catastrophe. Only when environments changed faster than biology could respond did the limitations of this system become apparent. Skin continued to behave as though sunlight would arrive with familiar rhythms, even as daily life began to disrupt those rhythms in subtle ways. This persistence did not signal rigidity so much as inertia. Evolution had no mechanism to anticipate future conditions. It could only preserve what had worked before. Skin therefore retained features that were statistically successful over many generations, even if their relevance diminished. These features shaped how the body interpreted light, heat, and seasonal variation, guiding physiological responses without conscious input. Hormonal cycles, immune activity, and patterns of repair followed signals that entered through the skin, reinforcing the influence of ancient sunlight on systems far removed from the surface. Because these signals were integrated into broader regulatory networks, altering them would have required coordinated change across multiple systems, not just the skin itself. Such coordination rarely occurs quickly in evolution. As a result, skin remained anchored to its inherited logic, while other aspects of human life began to shift more rapidly. Cultural practices reduced exposure, altered daily schedules, and introduced artificial light. But biology absorbed these changes rather than restructuring itself in response. Skin continued to pass forward its ancient expectations, trusting that they would remain adequate. This trust was not conscious or intentional. It was the default outcome of a process that favored continuity over experimentation. Traits that did not cause immediate failure persisted, regardless of whether they were ideally suited to new conditions. Over generations, this produced a body that could tolerate increasing mismatch between biology and environment without collapsing. Skin absorbed the strain by operating within broader safety margins, allowing humans to survive while carrying forward outdated assumptions. This tolerance delayed the need for adaptation, reinforcing the preservation of ancient traits. The result was a layered biological system in which present function rested on past experience, even when the two no longer aligned perfectly. Skin did not evolve to reflect the present moment. It evolved to protect against risks that had dominated the past. Its role as a biological record ensured survival across uncertain environments, but it also constrained flexibility when conditions shifted rapidly. By carrying forward the imprint of ancient sunlight, skin maintained continuity across generations, anchoring the human body to its evolutionary history even as the world around it slowly moved on. As this inherited logic continued to govern the skin across generations, its role as a biological archive became more deeply entrenched within the body as a whole. The skin did not operate in isolation, but fed information into systems that regulated growth, repair, immunity, and long-term maintenance. Signals triggered by light exposure influenced hormonal pathways and metabolic rhythms that extended far beyond the surface. Because these systems evolved together, they shared the same historical assumptions. They expected light to arrive in certain patterns, at certain intensities, and over certain spans of time. When those expectations were met, internal coordination remained stable. When they were not, the body did not immediately recognize the mismatch as a problem. Instead, it compensated quietly, adjusting behavior and short-term physiology while leaving the underlying structure intact. This ability to compensate masked the extent to which biology had become anchored to conditions that no longer reliably existed. The skin continued to transmit signals shaped by ancient sunlight, and the body continued to interpret them as meaningful, even when exposure was brief, irregular, or artificially altered. Over time, This created a situation in which present experience and inherited biology drifted further apart without triggering decisive evolutionary response. From an evolutionary standpoint, there was little incentive to intervene. Individuals could still survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes. The costs of mismatch accumulated slowly, often appearing after reproductive years had passed. As a result, the ancient template persisted, reinforced by the absence of immediate failure. Skin remained committed to its historical role, carrying forward assumptions that had once ensured survival across open landscapes and long days under natural light. This commitment shaped how the body interpreted modern conditions, treating them as variations rather than departures. Artificial lighting, indoor living, and altered daily schedules were absorbed into existing frameworks instead of prompting redesign. The skin did not recognize these changes as fundamentally new. It responded as if the sun were still the primary organizer of life, even when that was no longer true. This explains why skin reactions can feel exaggerated or poorly matched to modern exposure patterns. They are calibrated for a different baseline, one in which light was abundant, predictable, and unavoidable. The persistence of this calibration reflects a deeper evolutionary principle. Biology prioritizes continuity over precision, preserving systems that work well enough across many environments rather than tailoring them narrowly to current conditions. Skin exemplifies this principle by retaining responses shaped under ancient skies while tolerating growing divergence between biology and behavior. It functions as a stabilizing force, preventing rapid breakdown at the cost of reduced adaptability. By the time human environments changed dramatically, skin was already bound into a network of systems that depended on its signals. Altering it would have required coordinated change across the body, something evolution rarely accomplishes quickly. Instead, humans relied on cultural solutions to manage the mismatch, further reducing selective pressure for biological change. Skin remained what it had always been, a mediator between the body and the world, executing a program written by long exposure to ancient sunlight. Its role as a biological record reached completion not because it perfectly matched present conditions, but because it continued to support life without catastrophic failure. In this way, the skin carried the past forward into the present, anchoring human biology to a history it could not simply discard, and setting the stage for tensions that would only become visible when the relationship with light changed more abruptly than ever before. As human societies entered periods of more complex settlement, a subtle but profound shift began to unfold in the relationship between skin and sunlight. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people started spending significant portions of their lives partially shielded from direct exposure. Simple shelters, thicker clothing, and more permanent dwellings reduced the amount of natural light reaching the body on a daily basis. This change was gradual and uneven, unfolding over centuries rather than generations, but it marked a decisive departure from the conditions under which skin had evolved. Skin continued to operate as if sunlight were abundant and unavoidable, yet daily life increasingly contradicted that assumption. The body did not immediately register this contradiction as a threat, and survival and reproduction remained possible, so there was no urgent evolutionary signal demanding redesign. Instead, the mismatch accumulated quietly, embedded in routines that limited exposure without eliminating it entirely. This partial separation from sunlight altered patterns of exposure rather than removing them. People still worked outdoors, traveled, and interacted under the open sky, but these activities became more structured and seasonal. Periods of intense exposure were followed by longer intervals of relative absence. Skin, shaped by ancient expectations of regular contact, responded to this irregularity using the same mechanisms it always had. Protective responses activated quickly during exposure, while internal systems waited for signals that arrived less consistently. The body attempted to interpret these fragmented inputs as variations of an older pattern rather than recognizing them as a fundamentally new condition. This interpretation allowed skin and associated systems to continue functioning without immediate breakdown, even as the rhythm of light grew increasingly uneven. Cultural adaptations amplified this effect. Clothing evolved to provide insulation, modesty, and protection from climate, further reducing the skin's direct contact with sunlight. Architectural developments created shaded interiors and enclosed spaces that limited exposure during large portions of the day. These changes did not occur everywhere at once, nor did they affect all individuals equally, but over time they became widespread enough to alter the average human experience. Skin, however, did not adapt to these changes at the same pace. It remained configured for a life spent largely outdoors, interpreting reduced exposure as temporary rather than permanent. This assumption worked well enough as long as some sunlight remained part of daily or seasonal life. What makes this phase significant is that it introduced a new kind of stability, not in the environment, but in behavior. Humans began to create consistent patterns of limited exposure that repeated across generations. Children grew up in conditions where sunlight was filtered, delayed, or partially blocked. Yet they inherited skin shaped by far brighter histories. The body compensated through short-term physiological adjustments and through reliance on behavior rather than biology. Diet, activity patterns, and social organization absorbed some of the strain created by reduced exposure. These compensations masked the underlying mismatch, allowing it to persist without triggering strong selective pressure. From an evolutionary perspective, this was a critical transition. Skin was no longer responding primarily to natural conditions, but to conditions mediated by culture. Yet biology remained anchored to assumptions formed long before cultural buffering existed. The result was a layered system in which ancient biological expectations coexisted with newly constructed environments. Skin continued to act as if sunlight would remain a central organizing force, even as human life increasingly unfolded indoors or under protection. This coexistence did not immediately produce crisis. It produced continuity. The body survived, reproduced, and carried forward its inherited logic, setting the stage for a far greater separation from natural light that would arrive later and more abruptly than anything before. As this culturally mediated separation from sunlight became more established, its effects extended beyond simple reduction in exposure and began to reshape the timing and structure of daily life itself. Light no longer arrived solely from the sky, dictating when people woke, worked, and rested. Instead, human activity increasingly followed social schedules, seasonal demands of agriculture, and later, constructed routines that were only loosely aligned with natural daylight. Skin, however, continued to function as if light were the primary organizer of time. It responded to exposure when it occurred, but it could not recalibrate its expectations about when and how often that exposure should happen. The body's internal rhythms, many of which were influenced indirectly by signals passing through the skin, became dependent on increasingly irregular cues. This did not cause immediate dysfunction. The human organism proved remarkably capable of short-term compensation, but the underlying biological logic remained unchanged, operating according to assumptions that no longer reliably described lived experience. This growing irregularity created a new kind of mismatch. In earlier environments, variation in sunlight was seasonal but predictable. Now, exposure varied according to work, housing, and social structure. Some individuals spent long hours outdoors, while others remained largely inside. Skin treated both patterns as temporary deviations rather than stable conditions. It maintained protective responses as if intense exposure could resume at any time, while internal systems waited for signals that arrived inconsistently. This produced a state in which the body was neither fully adapted to abundant light nor fully adjusted to scarcity. Instead, it hovered between the two, relying on behavioral solutions to bridge the gap. Clothing could be removed, windows could be opened, outdoor labor could increase. These possibilities reduced the evolutionary pressure to alter skin itself. Over generations, this arrangement normalized. Children inherited skin shaped by ancient sunlight, but grew up in environments where exposure was mediated by architecture and custom. Their bodies learned to function within this hybrid system, combining biological expectations with cultural modification. Importantly, this learning did not occur at the genetic level. It was physiological and behavioral, not evolutionary. Skin remained fundamentally the same, while habits changed around it. This separation between biology and behavior allowed human societies to expand into environments that would otherwise have imposed severe constraints. It also delayed the consequences of mismatch, spreading them thinly across populations and lifespans, rather than concentrating them into a single selective event. The gradual nature of this shift made it difficult for evolution to respond decisively. There was no clear moment when reduced sunlight exposure caused widespread failure of survival or reproduction. Instead, the effects were subtle, influencing growth, resilience, and long-term health, without preventing populations from sustaining themselves. From the perspective of natural selection, this was tolerable. Skin continued to perform its essential functions during the years that mattered most for reproduction, even if later life outcomes were compromised. The ancient compromise remained intact, shielded by cultural buffering that reduced the urgency of biological change. This phase marked a quiet turning point. Humans had begun to reshape their relationship with light without altering the biology that mediated it. Skin was still executing a program written for open skies, while daily life increasingly unfolded under cover. The body adapted behaviorally, not biologically, accepting a growing divergence between inherited expectations and present conditions. This divergence did not yet produce crisis. It produced stability of a new kind, one sustained by culture rather than evolution. In doing so, it prepared the ground for a far more dramatic transformation, when separation from natural sunlight would become not partial or seasonal, but continuous and nearly complete. As this divergence between biological expectation and lived experience continued, the role of skin shifted again, not through redesign but through accommodation. Human life became increasingly structured around enclosed spaces, seasonal labor patterns, and social rhythms that no longer mirrored the movement of the sun. Exposure to natural light became fragmented, sometimes intense, sometimes absent, often unpredictable. Skin continued to respond to light as it always had, activating protective and regulatory mechanisms whenever exposure occurred, but it could not distinguish between a brief encounter and a sustained environment. To the body, sunlight still signaled a world where exposure was the norm rather than the exception. This meant that even limited contact could trigger responses calibrated for far greater intensity and duration. The body treated these signals as meaningful, integrating them into hormonal, immune, and metabolic processes that assumed a broader context of light than daily life now provided. Over time, this created a subtle form of overreaction and underreaction occurring simultaneously, with some systems responding strongly to brief exposure, while others waited for signals that never fully arrived. Cultural solutions increasingly carried the burden of managing this mismatch. Diet compensated where light was scarce, routines adapted to seasons, and social structures distributed labor in ways that reduced individual exposure. These adjustments allowed populations to function without requiring biological change. From the perspective of evolution, this was sufficient. Skin continued to support survival and reproduction, even if it no longer aligned perfectly with environmental conditions. The costs of misalignment accumulated slowly, often emerging as reduced resilience, chronic strain, or gradual decline later in life. These outcomes did not prevent populations from sustaining themselves, and therefore did not exert strong selective pressure. The ancient biological program remained intact, protected by the buffering effects of culture. This phase completed a long transition. Skin was no longer the primary mediator between the body and sunlight. That role had been partially transferred to clothing, shelter, and social organization. Yet skin did not relinquish its function. It continued to operate as if the old relationship still applied, maintaining assumptions that were no longer fully valid. This coexistence of ancient biology and modified behavior produced a stable but imperfect system. Humans lived successfully within it, but at the cost of carrying forward unresolved tensions between what the body expected and what the environment delivered. By the end of this period, the separation from natural sunlight had become a defining feature of human life rather than an exception. Skin remained shaped by ancient skies, while daily existence unfolded under conditions those skies never anticipated. The body endured this change not by adaptation, but by tolerance. It relied on cultural scaffolding to absorb the strain, allowing biology to remain largely unchanged. This tolerance ensured continuity across generations, but it also fixed the limits of flexibility. Skin could no longer easily realign with new patterns of light, because the pressures that once shaped it had been softened rather than replaced. In this way, the long process of partial separation reached its conclusion, The ancient relationship between skin and sunlight was not broken, but it was no longer direct. It persisted as an inherited framework operating beneath the surface of a world that had quietly moved on, setting the stage for an even more abrupt disconnection that would follow. As human life moved decisively indoors, the relationship between skin and light entered a phase unlike anything in earlier history. For the first time, large populations spent most of their waking hours shielded from the sky, not temporarily or seasonally, but as a stable condition of daily existence. Walls, roofs, and later glass did more than block wind or rain. They filtered, weakened, and reshaped light itself. The body still encountered brightness, but its quality was different. The spectrum was altered, the intensity reduced, and the timing detached from the natural arc of the sun. Skin, however, continued to interpret light according to ancient rules. It did not distinguish between sunlight that had travelled directly from the sky and light that had been reflected, diffused, or constrained by architecture. To the body, light remained a signal of environmental presence, even when that signal no longer carried the same information it once did. This change did not remove sunlight from human life. It transformed it into something biologically ambiguous. Exposure became insufficient to fully satisfy ancient biological expectations, yet frequent enough to prevent clear failure. Skin responded as if living under partial shade, rather than under a fundamentally new condition. Internal systems waited for signals that arrived in diluted form, while protective mechanisms remained ready for exposure that rarely reached ancestral intensity. This created a state of chronic approximation rather than alignment. The body operated close to balance without ever fully achieving it. From an evolutionary standpoint, this condition was stable enough to persist. Individuals survived, reproduced, and raised children without catastrophic consequence. The costs of mismatch accumulated slowly, often expressed as subtle vulnerability rather than immediate breakdown. Bone strength, immune resilience, and metabolic efficiency were influenced incrementally, shaped by light that was present but incomplete. Skin continued to transmit information into the body based on assumptions that no longer held true, but the organism compensated through redundancy and behavioral adjustment. Artificial lighting extended days and softened nights, providing brightness without the biological specificity of sunlight. Skin responded to this brightness as it could, even though it lacked the ultraviolet component that once carried much of the evolutionary meaning. To the body, the distinction was not obvious. Signals were received, but they were imprecise. This imprecision blurred the boundary between day and night, exposure and absence, creating a physiological background noise that had no equivalent in the past. Yet because this noise did not prevent life from continuing, it did not trigger evolutionary correction. Skin remained configured for a world where light was clear, directional, and tied to the sky. Instead, it now mediated a relationship with light that was diffuse, prolonged, and detached from natural cycles. This shift marked a quiet but decisive turning point. Humans were no longer merely buffering sunlight through culture. They were replacing it with an artificial environment that biology had never encountered. Skin stood at the boundary of this change, continuing to execute an ancient program while processing signals that only partially resembled those it was designed to read. The result was not immediate dysfunction, but a persistent state of biological compromise. Skin allowed life to proceed under altered conditions, but it did so by stretching ancient assumptions rather than rewriting them. This stretch defined a new normal, one in which the body remained anchored to evolutionary history while navigating an environment that increasingly diverged from it. As artificial lighting became a permanent feature of human environments, the skin was exposed to a form of light that carried brightness without the evolutionary signals it had been shaped to interpret. Lamps illuminated rooms long after sunset, extending waking hours and compressing darkness into shorter intervals. To human perception, this felt like continuity and control. To biology, it introduced confusion. Skin responded to light intensity but could not fully assess its quality. The absence of ultraviolet radiation meant that many of the downstream processes historically linked to sunlight were only weakly activated or not activated at all. Yet the presence of constant illumination prevented the body from clearly registering night as a time of rest and repair. Skin transmitted mixed signals, neither confirming full daylight nor allowing complete darkness to settle. Internal systems attempted to synchronize to these cues, adjusting hormone release, immune activity, and metabolic timing based on incomplete information. This did not cause immediate failure because human physiology is resilient and redundant. The body compensated by averaging signals over time, smoothing irregularities rather than resolving them. Over weeks, months, and years, this averaging produced a steady but shallow alignment with the environment. Skin continued to operate as if light exposure were meaningful, even when the biological content of that light had been stripped away. The result was a form of sensory dilution. Signals that once carried precise information about time, season, and exposure were replaced by a constant background brightness that lacked clear structure. From an evolutionary perspective, this condition was unprecedented. There had never been a period in which light was present without the sun. Skin was not designed to distinguish between natural and artificial sources. It treated illumination as illumination, responding according to rules written when all light came from the sky. This made artificial lighting biologically ambiguous. It was enough to disrupt ancient rhythms, but insufficient to support the functions that depended on true sunlight. The body existed in a partial state, neither fully aligned with day nor fully released into night. Cultural routines reinforced this condition. Work schedules, social activity, and domestic life filled hours that had once been dark. Skin became exposed to light at times when it historically would not have been, sending signals into systems that expected darkness. These systems adapted behaviorally, delaying sleep, shifting activity, and tolerating altered rhythms. Biology absorbed these changes rather than opposing them. As long as individuals remained capable of survival and reproduction, there was no strong evolutionary incentive to restore alignment. The costs of this dilution accumulated slowly, influencing long-term health and resilience rather than immediate viability. Skin continued to mediate light exposure according to ancient logic, but the information it transmitted grew less precise with each technological layer added between body and sky. The boundary between day and night blurred, not because the sun changed, but because its signals were overridden. Skin did not recognize this override as a replacement. It interpreted it as variation, responding conservatively to avoid catastrophic error. This conservatism allowed human societies to function under artificial light without biological collapse. But it also locked the body into a prolonged state of approximation. Skin stretched its ancient program to accommodate a new reality, but it could not rewrite that program on its own. The relationship between skin and light became increasingly indirect, mediated by technology rather than environment. What had once been a clear conversation between body and sky was transformed into a muted exchange filled with noise. Skin continued to listen, continuing to respond, even as the meaning of what it received drifted further from the conditions that had shaped it. As this artificial environment stabilized across generations, the skin settled into a role defined less by direct interaction with sunlight and more by continuous adjustment to signals that no longer matched its original design. Light was present almost all the time, yet it rarely carried the full information that natural sunlight once provided. Skin responded to brightness and duration, but the deeper cues tied to spectrum and intensity were absent or inconsistent. To the body, this meant operating under a permanent ambiguity. The skin continued to initiate protective responses when exposed to brighter conditions, even though those conditions no longer represented the ancestral risks they once did. At the same time, it failed to trigger the full range of internal processes that depended on genuine solar input. This created a persistent imbalance that did not announce itself clearly. There was no single failure point, no obvious breakdown. Instead, the body functioned within narrowed margins, relying on compensation rather than alignment. Internal systems adjusted their thresholds, tolerating weaker signals and extended exposure, smoothing irregular input rather than correcting its source. Over time, this tolerance became normalized. Individuals grew up assuming that constant illumination was ordinary, and their bodies adapted behaviorally to match. Skin did not resist this normalization. It absorbed it, continuing to translate light into biological signals, even as the meaning of those signals drifted further from their evolutionary origins. Because artificial light did not fluctuate with weather, season, or latitude in the same way as the sun, skin lost access to patterns that once provided structure. The body experienced light as a continuous condition rather than a directional one. This continuity reduced contrast between day and night, weakening the temporal boundaries that had once organized repair, rest, and renewal. Skin transmitted these softened cues into the body, and the body responded by extending activity and compressing recovery. None of this prevented survival. Human physiology proved capable of enduring prolonged mismatch by trading precision for persistence. Systems designed to operate in rhythm learned to function under approximation. This learning occurred within lifetimes, not across generations, allowing biology to remain structurally unchanged while behavior shifted around it. From an evolutionary standpoint, the absence of immediate reproductive failure meant there was little pressure to modify the skin itself. The ancient program remained intact, stretched to accommodate a new environment rather than replaced. Over generations, this stretching produced a body that lived under artificial light while still expecting the sun. Skin became a mediator of compromise, balancing outdated assumptions with modern conditions without resolving the contradiction. It continued to interpret light as meaningful, even when that meaning was incomplete. This persistence shaped health subtly and cumulatively, influencing resilience, recovery, and long-term stability rather than acute outcomes. The costs appeared gradually, distributed across time rather than concentrated into events that selection could act upon decisively. As a result, the relationship between skin and light reached a new equilibrium, one defined not by harmony but by endurance. The body survived by tolerating ambiguity, carrying forward a system that functioned well enough without fully understanding the signals it processed. Skin remained bound to its evolutionary past, executing responses shaped by ancient sunlight while navigating an environment increasingly dominated by artificial illumination. This final stage completed the long transition from direct exposure to mediated light. The connection between body and sky was no longer primary. It persisted as an inherited framework operating beneath layers of technology and habit. Skin continued to perform its role faithfully, not because it matched the present, but because it had no mechanism to release the past. In doing so, it carried ancient assumptions forward into a world that no longer resembled the one that formed them, closing a chapter in which sunlight ceased to be the dominant architect of daily life, even as its imprint remained written across the surface of the human body. As the long separation from natural sunlight settled into permanence, its effects began to surface not as sudden changes, but as gradual shifts distributed across populations and generations. Skin continued to function according to ancient expectations, but the consequences of that mismatch were no longer confined to individual biology. They began to appear at the level of groups, patterns, and averages. Differences in health, resilience, and aging emerged not because skin failed, but because it continued to operate under assumptions that no longer described the shared environment. Populations living under similar artificial lighting conditions showed converging patterns of strain, even when genetics and geography differed. This indicated that the influence of light had moved from shaping bodies directly to shaping outcomes indirectly, through its interaction with inherited biology that could not fully adjust. Skin remained the entry point for this influence, translating light into signals that guided internal systems, even as the meaning of those signals drifted further from their evolutionary origins. Over time, this produced population-level tendencies rather than individual anomalies. Bone density, immune robustness, and metabolic stability varied in ways that correlated more strongly with lifestyle and environment than with ancestry. Skin, shaped by ancient sunlight, became a constant factor interacting with a new and shared condition: prolonged indoor life. This shift revealed a subtle generational layering. Each generation inherited the same biological framework, but experienced it under slightly altered circumstances. Children born into artificial environments encountered light patterns different from those of their parents, yet their skin was tuned to even earlier conditions. The gap between biology and environment widened incrementally, not enough to disrupt reproduction, but enough to influence development and long-term health. These influences accumulated statistically rather than dramatically. No single individual embodied the full cost of the mismatch, but populations carried it collectively. Skin continued to pass forward its inherited logic unchanged, while the environment applied pressure that could not be resolved within a lifetime. This created a situation where adaptation occurred through behavior and technology rather than through biology. further reducing selective pressure on skin itself. At the population level, this produced a form of hidden uniformity. Despite cultural and genetic diversity, many modern groups shared similar exposure patterns and similar biological responses. Skin mediated these responses in the same way across populations because it followed the same ancient rules everywhere. Artificial light blurred differences once imposed by latitude and season, creating a shared biological context that evolution had never prepared humans to inhabit. The body responded conservatively, maintaining internal stability at the cost of long-term optimization. Skin helped buffer these changes, absorbing variability without collapsing, but it could not restore alignment between biology and environment. This buffering masked the depth of the shift. Because populations continued to grow and function, the mismatch appeared manageable. Yet beneath this surface stability, small disadvantages accumulated. Recovery slowed, resilience decreased, and vulnerability increased in ways that were difficult to attribute to any single cause. Skin remained part of this process, quietly mediating signals that shaped population-level outcomes without drawing attention to itself. Its role was no longer to align the body perfectly with its environment, but to prevent failure under conditions that diverged steadily from those it had evolved to handle. This phase marked a transition in how evolutionary history expressed itself. Skin no longer shaped survival by selecting who lived or died under the sun. Instead, it shaped distributions of health and aging across populations living under artificial conditions. The ancient imprint of sunlight persisted, not as a visible marker, but as a statistical influence woven into modern life. Skin carried forward a logic that had once been essential, allowing populations to survive a profound environmental shift without immediate collapse. In doing so, it revealed the limits of biological adaptation when change occurs faster than evolution can follow, setting the stage for questions not about survival, but about how inherited bodies cope with a world they were never designed to inhabit. As these population-level patterns continued to unfold, the effects of ancient sunlight became visible not through dramatic differences between groups, but through subtle shifts in how generations related to their own bodies over time. Skin remained biologically consistent from one generation to the next, but the context in which it operated kept changing. Children inherited skin shaped by evolutionary pressures that assumed regular exposure to natural light, yet they grew up in environments where that exposure was fragmented, delayed, or replaced entirely. This created developmental trajectories that differed quietly from those of earlier generations. Growth, immune calibration, and long-term maintenance followed the same biological rules, but the inputs feeding those rules were altered. Skin transmitted signals into the body that once carried clear environmental meaning, yet now arrived weakened or distorted, influencing development in ways that were cumulative rather than immediate. Across generations, this produced differences that were statistical rather than visible. No single trait marked the change. Instead, populations showed gradual shifts in average resilience, recovery, and aging patterns. Skin did not cause these shifts directly. It acted as a constant mediator, applying ancient logic to modern conditions. The result was a body that developed normally by historical standards, yet increasingly diverged from the environment it inhabited. These divergences were small enough to escape notice within individual lives, but large enough to appear when viewed across many people and long periods of time. Skin continued to regulate exposure as if sunlight remained a central organizing force, even as daily life reduced its influence. This persistence created a baseline that no longer matched shared experience. What made this generational process difficult to correct was its distributed nature. There was no single moment when biology failed, no clear signal for selection to act upon. Each generation functioned adequately within its environment, supported by cultural practices, medical intervention, and social organization. Skin performed its role reliably during early life, when survival and reproduction mattered most, even if later life outcomes were compromised. From an evolutionary perspective, this was sufficient. The ancient biological framework remained intact because it did not prevent populations from continuing. The costs were deferred, spread thinly across lifespans, rather than concentrated into reproductive failure. This deferral altered how evolutionary history expressed itself. Instead of shaping who survived under the sun, it shaped how populations aged under artificial conditions. Skin carried forward expectations that influenced internal systems long after their original purpose had faded. Hormonal timing, immune readiness, and repair processes continued to follow patterns linked to light exposure that no longer reflected reality. Over generations, these patterns contributed to shared vulnerabilities that appeared normal because they were widespread. Skin helped normalize the mismatch by maintaining continuity, ensuring that bodies developed within familiar biological boundaries even as environments drifted away from them. At this scale, the ancient imprint of sunlight became less about visible difference and more about inherited constraint. Populations lived inside bodies optimized for a past that no longer existed, yet those bodies remained stable enough to support modern life. Skin played a central role in this stability, absorbing environmental change without demanding biological redesign. It allowed each generation to function without resolving the underlying tension between biology and environment. This created a form of evolutionary inertia that extended across decades and centuries, not because it was ideal, but because it avoided collapse. By this point, the influence of ancient sunlight had fully transitioned from an immediate selective force to a background condition shaping long-term outcomes. Skin no longer determined survival under open skies. It shaped how generations accumulated small disadvantages under enclosed ones. This marked the deepening of a new phase in human history, where inherited biology continued to guide development even as the environment it expected had largely disappeared, preparing the ground for a final question not about adaptation, but about what it means to live sustainably inside a body shaped for a different world. As this intergenerational accumulation reached maturity, the influence of ancient sunlight became fully embedded in how populations understood normality itself. Skin continued to deliver biological signals shaped by long evolutionary history, but those signals now defined a baseline that no longer reflected the environment in which people lived. What once had been a precise dialogue between body and sky turned into a set of inherited expectations that quietly framed development, aging, and resilience. Individuals grew up experiencing similar limitations and vulnerabilities, not because of shared genetics alone, but because the same ancient biological logic was being applied to a modern context across entire populations. Skin did not adapt to this context. It standardized it. By mediating light in the same way for everyone, it helped produce a common physiological background against which variation appeared minor. This made the mismatch harder to detect, because it did not manifest as an anomaly. It became the norm. Generations inherited bodies that behaved consistently, even if that behavior was no longer ideally suited to present conditions. From an evolutionary perspective, this consistency was advantageous. It preserved stability and predictability in development, reducing the risk of catastrophic failure. However, it also fixed certain limits. Populations could not easily move beyond the constraints imposed by skin's inherited assumptions, because those assumptions were deeply integrated into broader regulatory systems. Hormonal timing, immune calibration, and long-term repair followed pathways that remained linked to light exposure patterns that no longer existed. Over time, this produced a form of shared biological inertia. Change occurred around the body rather than within it. Technology, medicine, and social organization compensated for limitations instead of removing them. Skin remained unchanged, continuing to translate modern light into ancient signals. This translation shaped population-level outcomes subtly but persistently, influencing how quickly people recovered, how resilient they remained, and how aging unfolded across decades. These effects were not dramatic enough to trigger selection, but they were widespread enough to define experience. Ancient sunlight no longer decided who survived childhood or reproduced successfully. Instead, it shaped how populations aged, how long health was maintained, and how vulnerability accumulated over time. Skin carried forward this influence not as a relic, but as an active constraint. It ensured continuity by applying familiar rules in unfamiliar circumstances. This continuity allowed human societies to thrive materially while carrying forward biological assumptions that were no longer tested against the environment that had formed them. By the end of this phase, the role of skin had fully shifted. It was no longer an adaptive interface responding to present conditions. It was a stabilizing structure, preserving the past. Through it, ancient sunlight continued to shape human life indirectly, not by determining survival under the sky, but by defining the limits within which modern populations could operate. This completed the transition from evolutionary pressure to inherited constraint, setting the stage for the final question of how humans might live consciously within bodies shaped by a world that no longer exists. As the long arc of this history comes into view, a final shift in perspective becomes possible, one that no longer asks how skin adapted, but how humans now live inside the consequences of that adaptation. Skin continues to operate faithfully according to rules shaped by ancient sunlight, even though those rules no longer describe the world most people inhabit. The body wakes, repairs, and ages inside a framework that assumes regular exposure to natural light, gradual transitions between day and night, and seasonal rhythms that once structured life outdoors. Modern environments provide substitutes for these conditions, but they do not replicate them. Skin interprets light that is weaker, fragmented, or artificial as variation rather than replacement, and the body responds by stretching its ancient logic to fit a new reality. This stretching allows life to continue, but it also defines the limits within which modern humans must operate. The body does not reset its expectations simply because the environment has changed. It carries them forward, shaping experience quietly and persistently. At this point, the question is no longer evolutionary in the traditional sense. There is little selective pressure acting on skin in environments buffered by technology, medicine, and social systems. Survival and reproduction are largely detached from natural light exposure, at least in the short term. This means that the ancient biological framework is likely to persist far longer than the conditions that formed it. Skin will continue to behave as if sunlight remains central, even if daily life rarely reflects that assumption. The consequences of this persistence will not appear as dramatic failures, but as boundaries. Limits on resilience, recovery, and long-term stability will remain anchored in biology that evolved for a different world. Humans will continue to manage these limits culturally, adjusting behavior, environment, and technology rather than redesigning the body itself. This realization reframes the relationship between past and present. Skin is not outdated in a simplistic sense. It is precise within the context that shaped it. The mismatch arises not because biology is flawed, but because the environment has changed faster than biology can follow. Understanding this shifts responsibility away from the body and toward how humans choose to live within it. The question becomes how to recognize the signals skin still responds to, and how to interpret them wisely rather than ignoring or overriding them completely. Ancient sunlight no longer governs daily life, but its imprint remains active, influencing internal rhythms that modern conditions often disrupt. Living consciously inside this inherited framework requires acknowledging that the body carries expectations that cannot be erased. Skin will continue to mediate light, transmit signals, and shape internal systems according to ancient assumptions. Modern life can either work with those assumptions or continue to obscure them. This is not a call to return to the past, but an invitation to understand it. The body is not asking to be redesigned. It is asking to be understood within the limits set by its history. By recognizing how deeply ancient sunlight has shaped the skin, and through it, the entire organism, humans gain the ability to make choices that respect those constraints, rather than fighting them blindly. This perspective does not offer a solution in the form of optimization or correction. Evolution rarely provides clean answers. Instead, it offers context. Skin tells a story of endurance, compromise, and continuity across deep time. That story continues to shape human life, not as destiny, but as boundary. The final question is not whether the body can adapt to the modern world, but whether modern life can be shaped in ways that acknowledge the body it inhabits, a body still carrying the quiet imprint of a sun that once defined what it meant to be human. As this awareness deepens, the role of understanding shifts from biology to choice, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of alignment. Skin will not change quickly, and it does not need to. Its responses remain consistent because they were shaped to endure uncertainty rather than anticipate novelty. What changes instead is how humans interpret the signals their bodies continue to send. Light still enters through the skin as information, even when its source is artificial or indirect. The body still responds with adjustments in timing, repair, and regulation, even when those adjustments feel muted or confusing. Recognizing this does not require reversing modern life. It requires noticing where expectations diverge from reality. Ancient sunlight-structured days with clear beginnings and endings created predictable contrasts between exposure and rest, and anchored activity to seasonal rhythms. Modern environments blur these contrasts, offering continuity where there was once interruption. Skin absorbs this continuity without resistance, but internal systems respond by stretching rather than synchronizing. The result is not failure, but a quieter form of imbalance that accumulates over time. Awareness allows this accumulation to be seen not as personal weakness, but as a structural outcome of living inside inherited limits. This reframing removes blame from the body and places responsibility on how environments are designed and routines are chosen. Skin does not demand restoration of the past. It responds best when patterns remain legible, when light still carries meaning rather than noise. Even modest alignment, clearer separation between day and night, more deliberate exposure rather than constant illumination, can reduce the strain created by ambiguity. These adjustments are cultural and behavioral, not biological, and they work precisely because biology remains stable. The skin's ancient logic provides a fixed reference point against which choices can be made. Without that reference, the body is treated as infinitely adaptable, leading to environments that ignore its constraints. Understanding reintroduces limits as guides rather than obstacles. It allows modern life to be shaped with respect for the signals the body still recognizes, without romanticizing the conditions that formed them. This is not a prescription, but a perspective. Skin carries forward a history that cannot be erased, but it can be acknowledged. When its signals are interpreted as context rather than commands, they inform rather than constrain. The body becomes a partner in adaptation rather than a problem to be solved. This partnership does not restore ancient sunlight to its original role, but it prevents complete disconnection. It preserves enough coherence between biology and environment to sustain resilience over time. In this way, ancient sunlight continues to matter, not as a force to be obeyed, but as a reference embedded in the body, reminding modern humans that survival was shaped by continuity, contrast, and rhythm. Living well inside that reminder means accepting that the body was built to endure patterns, not chaos, and that even in a world transformed by technology, those patterns still quietly support stability. The final task is not to change the skin, but to live in ways that recognize what it still expects, allowing modern life to unfold within boundaries set long before the present began. As this long narrative reaches its quiet conclusion, what remains is not a solution but a perspective shaped by patience and time. Human skin does not carry instructions for how to fix the modern world. It carries evidence of how life once worked well enough to continue. Its structure reflects compromise rather than optimization, endurance rather than efficiency. Ancient sunlight shaped the body under conditions of regularity, contrast, and rhythm, and those conditions left a permanent imprint. Modern life has not erased that imprint. It has simply learned to live around it. Skin still responds to light as information, still feeds signals into systems that evolved expecting clarity rather than abundance, and still anchors the body to patterns that once defined survival. This anchoring is neither a flaw nor a burden. It is a boundary. Within it, human life has flourished culturally, technologically, and socially, even as biology has remained largely unchanged. The tension between these two tempos, rapid environmental change and slow biological inheritance, defines much of modern experience. Skin sits at the center of this tension, not as a problem to be solved, but as a reminder of limits that cannot be negotiated away. Understanding this does not mean rejecting modernity or idealizing the past. It means recognizing that the body operates according to logics older than choice, convenience, or design. These logics persist because they once worked, and because they never failed badly enough to be replaced. Skin continues to execute an ancient program, translating light into meaning even when that meaning has become faint or distorted. The body adapts behaviorally, culturally, and psychologically, absorbing the mismatch rather than correcting it biologically. This absorption allows continuity, but it also explains why certain strains feel diffuse, chronic, and difficult to name. They are not signs of individual failure. They are expressions of living inside a body shaped for a world that moved more slowly and more predictably than the one we inhabit now. The value of this understanding lies not in prescription but in orientation. When the body is seen as historically grounded rather than endlessly adaptable, modern choices can be made with greater care. Light can be treated as more than brightness. Darkness can be allowed to mean rest again. Rhythm can be reintroduced not as nostalgia, but as respect for the constraints carried within living tissue. Skin does not demand obedience to the past. It quietly signals what once mattered enough to shape survival. Listening to that signal does not require reversal. It requires awareness. The long story of human skin shaped by ancient sunlight ends not with an answer, but with a question that remains open and unresolved. In a world where the sun no longer governs daily life, but its imprint still governs the body, how will humans choose to live inside a biology that remembers something the environment has forgotten?